Mathematics is the only religion the Mafia ever truly respected. In the underworld, they don't believe in heaven or hell. They believe in the ledger, profit and loss, asset and liability. If a man is a problem, you subtract him. If a politician is useful, you multiply his bank account. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the father of modern organized crime, built the five families on this cold, hard arithmetic. He believed that every human heart had a breaking point, a specific coordinate where morality dissolves and greed takes over. He believed he could calculate the price of a soul down to the penny. But in the late 1930s, Lucky Luciano encountered a variable he couldn't solve, an equation that refused to balance. He stood on the edge of Harlem, looking at a gold mine worth tens of millions of dollars, the illegal lottery known as the Numbers. It was a river of cash that flowed through the veins of Black New York, and Luciano wanted to build a dam. He wanted to divert that river into Italian pockets. But standing in the middle of the current was one man, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The Italians had the guns, they had the judges, and they had the political machine. But Bumpy had something deadlier. He had the love of the people. And you cannot assassinate a man who is protected by an entire city. So Luciano did what businessmen do when they cannot win a hostile takeover. He looked for a back door. He looked for the soft underbelly. His scouts whispered that Bumpy Johnson, the man who walked through hailstorms of bullets without flinching, had only one weakness. Her name was Mayme. To the Italians, she was just a wife, a domestic accessory, a woman who surely tired of the danger, the fear, and the police raids. They projected their own values onto her. They assumed she was like the mob wives of Little Italy, kept in the dark, hungry for diamonds, and quietly resentful. And so, the plan was set. It was a strategy born of arrogance. Luciano authorized a bribe that was unprecedented in the history of the American underworld. In today's valuation, the offer was equivalent to $5 million. It was generational wealth. It was change your name and move to Paris money. All Mayme Johnson had to do was open the door. All she had to do was whisper a location, hand over a book, or simply look the other way when the hit team arrived. The messenger sat across from her. He was slick, polished, and reeking of cologne that cost more than a Harlem rent check. He laid his hands on the leather case, smiling the smile of a man who believes he is bestowing a blessing. He told her that Bumpy was already a ghost. He told her that the war was coming, and she could either be a casualty or a queen. He spoke of safety. He spoke of a life where she didn't have to check the locks 3 times a night. He thought he was seducing her with freedom, but he had miscalculated the conversion rate. In Harlem, currency wasn't green paper. Currency was respect. Currency was the knowledge that you stood tall when others bowed. Mayme Johnson looked at that briefcase and didn't see $5 million. She saw a bribe for her husband's head. She saw 30 pieces of silver. She realized with a clarity that froze the air in the room that these men didn't respect her. They thought she was a prostitute for the highest bidder. She didn't flip the table. She didn't scream for the bouncers. Mayme Johnson simply looked at the messenger and destroyed him with a look of absolute pity. She conveyed, without uttering a single incriminating word, that his money was worthless here. She rejected the $5 million not because she didn't need it, but because the price was too high. The price was her dignity. The price was Bumpy, and Mrs. Johnson did not sell. That refusal was the most expensive no ever spoken in the history of organized crime. Because Mayme stayed loyal, Bumpy stayed in power. Because Bumpy stayed in power, he controlled the Harlem Numbers Racket for another 30 years. The Italian families were forced to negotiate, to scrap for crumbs, and eventually to retreat. Historians and forensic accountants have crunched the numbers. The revenue lost by the Genovese family because they couldn't break the Johnson household Over $50 million. Luciano died in exile, vomiting blood on a tarmac in Naples. Bumpy died a king in Harlem, eating fried chicken at Wells' restaurant. The money didn't save Lucky, and the lack of it didn't hurt Bumpy. The difference wasn't the cash. The difference was the woman sitting across the table. You've heard the legends of the Godfathers. You've seen the movies about the wise guys. But you have never heard the story of the woman who bankrupted the mob with a single glance. The history books left this chapter out, but we found the pages. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications, because we are about to open the files on the war that money couldn't win. This is Untold Mob Chronicles. Today, understand why a man like Lucky Luciano would offer a fortune to a woman he didn't respect. You have to understand the geography of greed. You have to understand that in the 1930s and 40s, Harlem was not just a neighborhood. It was a sovereign nation. It was an island of black capital surrounded by a sea of white hostility. And the heartbeat of that island, the thing that pumped the blood through its veins, was not the jazz clubs or the churches. It was the policy, the numbers game. To the outside world, it was illegal gambling. To the people of Harlem, it was the only bank that wouldn't slam the door in their faces. Wall Street had crashed and the white banks had retreated downtown, locking their vaults. But in Harlem, for a nickel or a dime, you could buy hope. You could pick 3 numbers, and if they hit, the payout was 600 to 1. It was the poor man's stock market. It put food on tables, it paid for funerals, and it sent children to college. And the man who sat at the top of this pyramid, the man who guaranteed the payout, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The math was staggering. The nickels and dimes added up to millions. The Harlem policy banks were holding more liquid cash than some legitimate institutions. And downtown, in the dark back rooms of the Italian social clubs, the 5 families were watching. Lucky Luciano, a man who viewed crime as a corporate structure, saw this revenue stream and felt a physical pain. It was money he wasn't controlling. It was a tax he wasn't collecting. Luciano was a student of history. He had seen what happened when Dutch Schultz, the Dutchman, tried to take Harlem by brute force. Schultz had sent hitmen. He had dropped bodies in the streets. And what did it get him? It got him a war he couldn't win, and eventually, it got him a bullet in the gut in a Newark tavern. Luciano was smarter. He knew that you couldn't conquer Harlem with a machine gun alone. Bumpy Johnson was too entrenched. Bumpy was the immune system of the neighborhood. If you attacked him directly, the streets closed ranks. So Luciano turned his gaze to the domestic sphere. He analyzed Bumpy Johnson not as a mythical gangster, but as a man. And every man has a blind spot. Luciano believed that Bumpy's vulnerability lay in the very thing that made him human, his home. The Italians operated under a strict patriarchal code where wives were kept in gilded cages, ignorant of the blood that paid for their furs. They projected this dynamic onto the Johnsons. They assumed Mayme was a civilian. They assumed she was a soft target. This was their critical error. They didn't understand the nature of a Harlem marriage in the chaotic years of the underworld. Mayme wasn't sitting in a tower waiting to be rescued. She was the quartermaster. She knew the routes. She knew the safe houses. She knew where the bank moved when the heat was on. Luciano thought he was approaching a fragile housewife with a life-changing offer. In reality, he was approaching the gatekeeper of the vault. The strategy was a hostile takeover in the truest sense. The $5 million bribe, an astronomical figure for the time, was calculated to be an offer impossible to refuse. Luciano reasoned that if he could turn Mayme, he wouldn't need to fight Bumpy. Bumpy would simply cease to be a threat. If his wife turned over the books, Bumpy would go to federal prison for tax evasion, just like Al Capone. It was a clean, bloodless solution. It was a business transaction. Luciano viewed the bribe as an investment. Spending $5 million to gain control of a $50 million empire was simply good business. It was a rounding error. He sat in his office, drinking espresso, waiting for the phone to ring. He was waiting for the confirmation that the Johnson problem had been solved with a checkbook. He didn't realize that he was trying to buy wind. He didn't realize that in Harlem, loyalty wasn't a commodity you could trade on the open market. It was a religion, and he was standing in the wrong church. They thought they had found the crack in the armor. They thought the wife was the weak link. But as the messenger waited for Mayme to speak, as the seconds ticked by like hours, the power dynamic began to shift. The hunter was about to realize that he had walked into the den of a lioness. Most documentaries tell you about the men who pulled the triggers, but the real history of the mob is written in the silence of the people who refuse to talk. We are piecing together the true story of the Johnson dynasty, one secret at a time. If you want to know what happened in that room and the devastating price the mob paid for their mistake, hit that subscribe button. The confrontation is next. The air in the room was heavy, smelling of stale tobacco and expensive leather. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a gunshot. But there were no guns here. Only a proposition. The messenger, a man whose name has been lost to the footnotes of history but whose arrogance remains legendary, leaned back in his chair. He had delivered his speech. He had laid out the terms. He had opened the briefcase. He waited. He expected the gasp. He expected the trembling hand reaching out to touch the bills. He expected the rapid blinking of a person calculating how quickly they could pack a suitcase. In his world, the world of the commission, the world of transactional loyalty, everyone folded when the pile was high enough. He had bought judges. He had bought police captains. He had bought politicians. A Harlem housewife should have been the easiest sale of his career. But Mayme Johnson didn't gasp. She didn't tremble. She sat with the poise of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side without smelling of smoke. She looked at the money, and then she looked at the man. It wasn't a look of anger. It was worse. It was a look of profound disappointment. She realized that these men, despite their power and their suits, were fundamentally stupid. They thought they could buy the sun. The messenger flinched when she moved. He thought she was reaching for a piece, but she just pulled out a cigarette. She didn't light it herself. She waited. A test. The messenger, realizing his mistake, fumbled for his lighter. The flame shook in his hand. Mayme leaned in, lit the cigarette, and blew a cloud of smoke directly at the open briefcase. She didn't speak for a long time. She let the silence do the work. She let him sweat. She let him realize that the power dynamic had inverted. He was no longer the benefactor. He was the intruder. When she finally looked at him, she communicated without words that his offer was not just rejected, it was ridiculous. She treated the $5 million like it was a pile of dirty laundry he had dumped on her table. She didn't say, "Get out." She didn't say, "Go to hell." She simply closed the lid of the briefcase. Click. The sound was quiet, but in Italia, that small room, it sounded like a judge's gavel coming down. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on the Italian empire's ambitions in Harlem. He tried to stammer a rebuttal. He tried to suggest that perhaps she didn't understand the figure, but she was already walking away. She left him there with his money. She left him with the realization that he had to go back to Lucky Luciano, the most dangerous man in America, and tell him that a woman in Harlem had laughed at his fortune. She didn't choose the money. She chose the war. She knew that by closing that case, she was signing up for raids, for harassment, for the constant threat of violence. She knew the Italians would not take this lightly. But she also knew that if she took that money, she would be selling her soul. And Mayme Johnson knew the value of things. The money was paper. Her loyalty was gold. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes, but the repercussions would last for 20 years. The messenger left Harlem with the money, but he left his dignity behind. and as he drove back downtown, the reality of the situation began to set in. They had played their ace card, and it had been trumped. Now they had to fight, and fighting Bumpy Johnson on his own turf, that was a losing proposition. Luciano thought money was the universal language. Mayme Johnson taught him a new dialect. The confrontation was over, but the fallout was just beginning. The decision made in this room would cost the Mafia an empire. If you want to see the math, the $50 million consequence of this rejection, subscribe now. The final chapter is the one the mob doesn't want you to see. The messenger returned to the Waldorf Astoria empty-handed. The walk from the elevator to Luciano's suite must have felt like a march to the gallows. When he entered, he didn't have to speak. The absence of the signature on the paper screamed louder than words. He had to explain to the boss of bosses that the money, the life-changing, empire-building fortune, had been treated like a nuisance. He had to explain that Mayme Johnson was not for sale. Luciano didn't rage. Men like Luciano don't throw tantrums, they assess liabilities, and in that moment he realized he had made a catastrophic strategic error. By trying to buy Mayme, he had insulted Bumpy, and by failing to buy her, he had proven that the Johnson dynasty was immune to the mob's greatest weapon, greed. The soft takeover was dead. Now there was only the hard way, and the hard way was expensive. For the next decade, the Italian families tried to bleed Harlem dry. They tried intimidation, they tried police pressure, they tried to set up rival banks. But without the keys to the kingdom, without the inside access that Mayme could have provided, they were outsiders looking in. They were trying to navigate a labyrinth in the dark. Every time they tried to muscle in on a number runner, the neighborhood swallowed the evidence. Every time they tried to bribe a lieutenant, the loyalty held firm. Let's look at the math. The Harlem policy racket generated millions of dollars annually in untraceable cash. The VIG, the house cut, was pure profit. If Luciano had secured Mayme's cooperation, the 5 families would have absorbed that revenue stream seamlessly. They would have franchised the game. But because they were locked out, because they had to fight for every inch of sidewalk, they hemorrhaged money. They spent millions on enforcement, on failed bribes, and on lawyers, while missing out on the daily cash flow of the lottery. Forensic historians estimate that the Harlem resistance cost the Genovese crime family upwards of $50 million over the course of Bumpy's reign. That is $50 million that never built casinos in Vegas, $50 million that never bribed senators, $50 million that vanished into the ether, all because one woman refused to open a briefcase. It was a slow bleed that weakened the family for a generation. And what of the players? The irony is as sharp as a razor. Lucky Luciano, the man with the millions, died in exile. He was deported, stripped of his American empire, and died of a heart attack at an airport in Naples, dreaming of the city he was banned from. His money couldn't buy him a ticket home. But Bumpy Johnson, he died in Harlem. He died eating chicken at Wells' restaurant, surrounded by the people who respected him. He didn't die rich in the way Wall Street counts richness, but he died a king. And Mayme? She outlived them all. She lived to tell the story. She lived to write the history that the Italians tried to erase. She proved that while money talks, loyalty echoes forever. The mob thought they were the sharks. They forgot that even sharks can drown if they swim into the wrong waters. The $5 million bribe was supposed to be the end of Bumpy Johnson. Instead, it became the most expensive mistake in mob history. This is the story the movies won't tell you. They want you to believe the Godfather always wins. But in Harlem, the Godfather met the Godmother, and he blinked. We have only scratched the surface of the Harlem underworld. Click subscribe, like the video to support real history, and tell us in the comments, would you have taken the $5 million? I'll see you in the next chapter.